The event involving Brian that we are most familiar with occurred on September 1st, 1987 in Concord, California. I was among the people who, thousands of miles away here in New York, happened to glance up at CNN broadcasting some news from the West Coast, Concord, California. A munitions train which had been trying to carry weapons of all sorts to various theaters of war for the United States, for a period of time had been thwarted by a number of activists, including Brian, who put themselves in front of the train and impeded its deadly traffic. On that day, however, September 1st, 1987, Brian, who was sitting on the tracks, and I'm sure that he will be talking about some of this, did not move from the track. His attention was diverted, and the train, instead of as it had done before, slowing and then finally stopping, accelerated, went over his body, entirely over his body, and he suffered horrible injuries. He lost, ultimately, both his legs, his skull was fractured, many other injuries that he sustained, and everyone around him sustained injuries as well because they had witnessed this horrific thing. Here in Albany, I saw it on television and was physically ill in the Capitol building where I was watching it. And it's just indelibly stamped into my memory. Since that time, since his remarkable recovery from that incident, Brian has not really slowed his activism. His activism began long before that. It had been expressed in fasts and vigils. It had been expressed in organizing against war, and in many ways. And he's done many remarkable things since that occurred, not the least of which is to write this book. And he's going on a tour now, a national tour, for this book. I want to welcome Brian to the Sanctuary for Independent Media. I think this is a place that he will hopefully feel comfortable in, and I know you will enjoy hearing him. So without further ado, please welcome Brian Willson. Thank you.
Thank you, Albany, for having me in this wonderful model for alternative education and media. I think it's a wonderful place. And Scott for making sure that this happens. So thank you, Scott, for doing this. As Scott said, we go back to 1974 when we were working on really prison moratorium and talking about strategies for abolition and so forth. This is about my 75th book talk, and I still don't quite know how to do them. So I don't have a format. I have my reader book that's all marked up as if I'm going to read from it. And I hardly ever read from it. Now I don't even know what these marks mean. They originally meant a certain idea here and a certain anecdote there. So I talk stream of consciousness, and I hope that it's coherent, and I like to have a lot of time for questions and feedback. The theme, one of the themes of the book is that we are not worth more, and they are not worth less. That permeates my thinking and feeling for much of my post-Vietnam life. That includes the idea that dignity trumps longevity, that life is a journey, not a destination. I've learned that by not attaching to outcomes, I avoid depression. Attaching to outcomes is a sure ticket for being depressed. And so I've had a lot of teachers to help me in this long journey. I have no particular religion, but I'm spiritual. I have no particular language or guru. I just am trying to work it out as I go along. It's true, I was born in Geneva, New York, and I grew up in Chautauqua County, which is the very westernmost county in New York State. And I was really a good kid. When I was, after I was struck by the train, the media went and actually found my Sunday school teacher from Geneva, 1947, in which she was quoted as saying, "Brian was such an ideal, cooperative little boy." I was a good little boy. And I was a good boy in high school in Chautauqua. I went to actually the Chautauqua Central School. Some of you might have heard of the Chautauqua Institution, and I went to high school, which is right across the street from the main gate of Chautauqua Institution. I was a good boy there. I was on the Honor Society Student Council. I was an all-conference athlete. I remained active in my church. I was a good Boy Scout. So I had all those good beginnings. And everything was hunky-dory. This was the McCarthy era, but I didn't really, I wasn't interested in politics. I just knew that I lived in the greatest country in the history of the world, endowed by God to bring Christianity to the heathen and prosperity to the impoverished. It was really a great story. It felt good to be part of that notion. Well, it all changed. I was in college and I was in graduate school. It all changed in 1966 when I got my draft notice. I'm going to raise this just a little bit. I got my draft notice, and I was for the war. I was for killing the commies, but I was what they would call a chicken hawk, perhaps. Hawk on the war, but I was a chicken. I didn't want to fight in the war. Much more comfortable to stay in graduate school. And so when I got my draft notice, I actually enlisted in the Air Force rather than go in the Army or the Marines in a 4-year program as an officer. So I was going to make more money. I was going to have less dangerous assignments. And so I thought that was cool, and then I would get out and resume my career, which was, at the time, I was in law school and also was getting a master's in criminology. So that all changed again when I was sent to Vietnam in 1969 as a ranger officer. I didn't know the Air Force had rangers, and I certainly didn't volunteer for that program. But there I was with 40 men in the Mekong Delta. Main job was simply to protect air bases from attacks, protect fighter bombers from being attacked and damaged. And after I'd been there about 4.5 weeks, I was given what was considered a very unusual but safe extra duty of going to bombing sites and assessing the success or not of the bombing missions. What was a target in Vietnam? I hadn't thought about it yet. I was still, even though I was 27, I was still very naive. I was still kind of a good little boy. I didn't think about what a target was until in 1 week in April of 1969 in Vinh Long province, about 70 miles south of what was then Saigon. A Vietnamese lieutenant would direct me in my Jeep to these bombing targets. And so we assessed 5 targets. These were newly trained South Vietnamese pilots. They had just been trained in Mississippi. They had just arrived in Vietnam. And the new jet fighter planes that we were giving, the A-37s, were just handed over to the Vietnamese. This was Nixon's Vietnamization, spring of '69. So in 1 week, 5 target areas. What were the targets? 5 inhabited, undefended fishing villages. And in that week, somewhere between 700 and 900 murdered Vietnamese, probably 65% of whom were children. And I thought, this can't be. This must be a mistake. This must be, there must be some explanation for this. And at the end of that week, I flew to Saigon to meet with our intelligence office, and I wanted to examine all the 7th Air Force bombing reports for the Delta for the previous week or two. And I knew the chief of our intelligence office, and I knew he was monitoring the bombings, because his job was to make sure where the quote-unquote VC units were and which ones were being wiped out. The VC, of course, being Viet Cong, who we call our enemy in Vietnam, which was a derogatory term for the National Liberation Front. I still hadn't caught on to the fact that we had invaded the country. That came just a little bit later, but while I was in Vietnam, but not quite then. We looked at the reports, and he was telling me that they reported. These were a combination of 7th Air Force and CIA reports. They had reported that a number of the VC units had been wiped out in bombing missions that previous, basically over the 2 weeks, but the week I was, that included the week I was looking at these bombing targets, these villages. And he said the very strange thing is that we get the reports that this unit and this unit and this unit and this unit and this unit was wiped out, but these same units reappear in other locations a few days later. And we can't figure this out. And I immediately then knew, okay, this is what's happening. They're bombing inhabited villages, calling them VC, so that they can get the body counts up for domestic politics in the United States and for the president and for just the feel-good that they needed, that they were winning the war, which meant killing more of them than they were killing of us. And that it was intentional, it was deliberate. The entire Delta, outside of a few urban areas, were totally in free fire zones. Imagine, we had created genocide zones, basically, in another country, all justified to kill the communists, including these hundreds of thousands of children that were in these villages all over Vietnam. So as you could understand, I was a changed person. I became very anti-war. I spoke out against the war to my superiors every day, many times every day from that point on. And it wasn't like I was going to stop the war or stop the bombings. It was simply a matter of keeping my sanity. Short of deserting, it was just a matter of saying, look, this violates Nuremberg principles, it violates the UN Charter, it violates the U.S. Constitution, blah, blah, blah. And one day I went into the command bunker and pulled the pins off the map, which were future targets for bombings. And I said, you cannot bomb these targets because they're villages. And we've learned in the rules of engagement that incorporates Nuremberg principles, so you do not target civilians or civilian infrastructure. And this big major in the command bunker, who I had never seen before, grabbed me by my shirt and just literally, he was 6'5", big guy, and I'm 6'3", pretty big, but he was bigger. Grabbed my shirt and just threw me out of the command bunker and laughed. Just said, get the hell out of here. So I knew, Yes, there's laws of war, rules of war, but it's just rhetoric. It's just sounds good, but when push comes to shove, there are no rules conducting this behavior. So from that point on, I was on a different path. I'm still on it. And I've had to ask this question, which actually led finally to the writing of this book, which took me 8 years to write, and many more years before I started thinking about writing it. The question is, how could a good boy like me, had been valedictorian in my class, I had been all conference in sports, I'd been a good Boy Scout, I had been Honor Society, twice on the student council. How could I have followed an order from another man to go 9,000 miles from my home farming village in Asheville, New York, to fishing villages 9,000 miles in another culture? I knew nothing about the culture, I knew nothing about the history, and follow orders to, in a sense, be part of a killing machine. Really a genocide machine. I know from studying that it is very easy that happens. It's been happening for several millenniums. But I wanted to know, how could it have happened to me? And thinking that I'm probably fairly typical in terms of my upbringing and how easy it is for these young men all over the world to follow orders, to follow the king, to follow the orders of the king, whether it's a president in a democratic society, a king in a monarchical society, or a dictator in a dictatorial society. At some level, I realized I had become totally dehumanized by being a good little boy. Now, I remember reading in the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson supposedly wrote a paragraph that starts out about the King of England exciting the merciless Indian savages, as the words go, to disturb our inhabitants on the frontier. Our inhabitants, meaning the European inhabitants. And I knew, even when I was in Vietnam, that even if there might not be sides in the most spiritual, philosophical way of looking at things, I was on the wrong side. Certainly that's how I felt at the time. And I knew that I had become one of the savages. I was looking at people in their villages who had probably never been more than 5 or 10 miles from their village, but they were in their village, not in my village. And so the whole thing seemed to be not just a theater of the absurd, but criminal and diabolical beyond my grasp. And then when I realized in 11 years of war by the U.S. against Asia, Southeast Asia, the Laotians, the Cambodians, the Vietnamese, in 11 years, we killed 6 million human beings in those countries. If you figure that out on a daily average, it's 2,100 human beings killed every day for 11 years. Is that graspable? How does one deal with that? How does one put that into the context of our own civilization that we have called an exceptional civilization? So I've spent many years studying evolutionary biology, psychology, anthropology, history, especially Jungian psychology, to understand how this happens in the big picture. How has this happened? How does it keep happening? What is it about us that we're missing something deep down that yearns in these crazy ways to make meaning out of life by killing people and demonizing others to help reinforce the fact that maybe I'm okay and maybe I'm not okay at some level that I know, but in order to feel okay, I have to put down other people so that I am okay at some superficial level in my brain. So this was all stuff that even when I met Scott in 1974, this was all things that were going on in my life as I was working for the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee to set up and maintain something called the National Moratorium on Prison Construction. By that time, I was a young criminologist. I had passed the bar in D.C. after Vietnam. After the military, I became a lawyer in D.C., but another thing happened was that when I had my first criminal case in D.C. courts, 1972, I think December, something happened to me when I heard the bailiff come in and say, "Everybody rise." Whoops. I thought, gee, that means I have to stand up when the judge comes in the courtroom. And already I was very suspicious of obedience to authority. I had, after 4 years in the military, after 4 years of having people saluting me who were beneath me in rank, and me having to salute people above me in rank, I didn't like it. Actually, I found it very repulsive. And I knew what the protocol of the court was. I briefed all those cases in law school. I paid all that tuition money, bought all those books, and here I was, had my opportunity now to begin. And 3 times in less than 2 weeks, I was threatened with contempt because I didn't stand up for the judge, knowing if I can't get a handle on this, I better walk out, because this is kind of stupid, really. I can't do this. This is ridiculous. And but it wasn't a thing in my brain. It was in my body. It was the way my body trembled when I thought about standing up. There was something about my body saying, this is not a trustworthy relationship for me. I don't think it's going to work for me. And so I didn't. I walked out. My wife at the time was a lawyer. I never told her in the 11 years we were married why I decided not to be a lawyer, because I actually was ashamed to tell her at the time that I had this problem with authority and I couldn't stand up for the judge, which is no big deal. You do it. You don't even have to like it. You just do it because that's what you have to do. Well, that was a clue to me that I need to listen very carefully to what I'm feeling inside. And it's what quantum physicists call body wisdom. That the feelings are in the body. The ancient memories of mammalian and hominid life reside in the cells, not in the brain. It's called cellular memory, or deeply embedded in the genetic code of humanity. These feelings are not to be taken lightly. And so that is another thing that I've wrestled with, because, it isn't anything I was taught or was told about or understood really, except through my experiences. So one of the themes in the book is about the need to understand that obedience to authority is not natural or healthy, and that cooperation horizontally is ancient and extremely healthy and extremely natural. So those themes I was always reading these themes, trying to understand more, getting more validation. My parents had disowned me after Vietnam. I was no longer the good little boy. I had told my family that I no longer wanted to hear about their state or their church. I said, it's all a lie. All the assumptions behind what I was led to believe, I don't trust. I think they're all probably fallacious upon more careful examination. And so that was a great motivator for being a student, finally. Being a student. I really studied that. I'm still studying. I still like to read. I didn't learn that in college and graduate school. So I got through the 70s okay. I wasn't really a vet in my mind. I kind of was hoping it just would all go away, just forget about the whole damn thing. It was so shameful to me. And I was working for a state senator in Massachusetts in 1981. I was his aide for prisons and mental health, and I could go into any prison and any mental hospital in Massachusetts at any time with my ID card. And I was investigating a lot of prison complaints, especially at Walpole State Prison, for any of you who might have heard of that prison. They changed the name for a while to Cedar Junction. I think it's gone back to Walpole, but it was Walpole at the time. And I had interviewed 400 prisoners over the course of many months, trying to establish this pattern of prison brutality complaints, which guards were most involved. And this one day, I was interviewing about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. All day I'd been on the cell block, interviewing prisoners through a little peephole in their door, about that big. I didn't want the guards coming down and getting the prisoners out because they just would sabotage my time. And at the beginning of this, at the entrance to the cell block on the same tier I was on, I heard screaming. I saw these guards pulling out a prisoner from his cell and stomping on him with their boots and hitting him with a club. He was screaming. And I was telling Scott a little bit about this. That's the point at which I became a Vietnam veteran, because I had what the psychiatrists call a psychotic flashback. I was on a tier at Walpole State Prison, but I was in a village, my brain. And I staggered off that cell block, staggered because I was stepping over bodies on the walkway and bracing myself against the cell doors to keep my balance as I was crying. And I had no idea what the guards thought. I'd been in and out of that prison for a year working on these interviews. And so I got to my car. I went through 7 doors. I had to go through 7 locked doors. The guards had to open them. And I had enough wherewithal to get to my car in the parking lot where I just sat for an hour and a half. And I just wept. I didn't want to be reminded of the details. And I was shaking like this, trembling. I couldn't drive. And shortly thereafter, when I got enough together to drive to my apartment in Boston, I went to a rap group because I said, well, now I'm a Vietnam veteran, and I got to go get some help. I got to deal with all this stuff inside of me. And so the first group I went to, which was in Brighton, Massachusetts, I said, actually I was reluctant to talk. I was kind of shy, but I knew I needed help. And so it took me a little while, but I finally said, after hearing several other vets tell their war stories, I said, in order to be healed from this experience, I need to talk about the immorality of the war. And the facilitator, a therapist, said, we don't bring up politics in the rap groups. I said, politics? I said, this is about how I got caught up in a diabolical policy that makes no sense. And we're like mercenaries, just murdering people at will, just like we're doing today in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we've been doing it for decades, actually. And not just us, all the empires do this, not unique to us. It's just that we now go everywhere, and we have all the modern technological weapons. And so they said, you cannot discuss the policies. I said, I'm talking about the moral issues of the war. This goes to the essence of who I am as a human being. I have to integrate all this into my journey. And so they had me removed from the group. I insisted that this become a focus of the rap group. It was not allowed, so I went to individual therapy. But that was a kind of a shock to me. You couldn't talk about the ethical and moral nature of what we were doing. 2,100 people murdered every day for 11 years. For what? To stop a good example of self-determination, I suspect, that the first world can't afford, because the first world's built on exploitation everywhere. It needs very compliant people in order for us to plunder their resources and their labor. Oh yes, I was understanding empire. Many years later, when I was in Nicaragua, before I lost my legs, I was in Esteli, January 1986. And I'd been there 7 days. And the Contras, as many of you remember, the Contras were Reagan's terrorists, funded by the U.S., armed by the U.S., trained by the U.S., housed in camps in Honduras and Costa Rica, and doing all these raids in the country, destroying health clinics, schools, teachers, Sandinista officials, roads, bridges, and so forth. The Contras attacked 3 farming cooperatives just east of Esteli. They killed 11 campesinos. I saw 6 of those campesinos coming into the cemetery in Esteli. Horse-drawn wagons pulling these bodies in open caskets, going by very slowly. As I stood there, I said, boy, I've been there before. Wow. This is how civilization works. It goes and plunders and crushes, kills, murders, maims, out of our view, outsources outside the boundaries of our culture, so people can continue to have their wonderful life, their conveniences, their comfort. As one of the Seneca Indians said to me when I was growing up in Western New York when I was a kid, he said, you know, we call the flag, the U.S. flag, Old Glory, not Old Glory. He said, the red is our blood and the white is our bones. And we were forced to be citizens in 1924. All these kids knew that. We didn't want to be citizens of the United States. It was our country to begin with. I hadn't really thought that through. It took me many years to grasp that. So when I saw those bodies, I realized that Nicaragua, Vietnam, and any other place I wanted to go and examine what was really happening, including Geneva, New York, where I was born, and looking at the history of Geneva going back to the 1700s, showed the same pattern. One group of people that call themselves exceptional need to have resources that are outside their original territory, and of course in the United States it was outside of England, so they had to come to the New World to get more territory. They justify it by saying the people that we're expanding to are savages, or in Vietnam my commander called the Vietnamese vermin. Most of the troops call them gooks. Anything to demonize them. Because we're the exceptional people and we have the capacity, the moral insight to judge them as to whether they're inferior or not. And of course, they're always inferior. This has been going on for 5,000 or 6,000 years. I had to understand this because it was the context I was trying to understand my own journey. Because it just seemed so unnatural and so just not anything that I came in the world to be part of. Was counting bodies after the bombing missions in another country. And in one case, I bent over in one of those villages looking at what looked like a young mother clutching 3 children. They had obviously tried to flee the bombing, but they got caught in the jellied roll of napalm. So everybody in those villages was burned. I mean, everybody on the ground was burned. if not asphyxiated, from the way the napalm takes the oxygen out of the air. If they weren't hit by bomb shrapnel, they were certainly finished off with napalm. But this woman's eyes were wide open. She was lying on her back, clutching 3 children. And I looked into her eye. I was in shock, but I looked into her eyes. For some reason, I was fascinated with these eyes looking at me, or as I was looking at her eyes. And the stench was so terrible, I had to have a handkerchief over my nose and mouth. You could smell the lingering napalm, you could smell the chemical residue of the bombs and the burning flesh. And I started crying. And the Vietnamese lieutenant who had guided me there asked me what my problem was. I was crying, looking at the scene, and well over 100 bodies lying around. And I said something that, again, was very much led to my search in life for meaning. I said, I'm looking at my sister. She is my sister. She is like my sister. And all these people in the village are part of my extended family. And he laughed, saying, they're communists, So I didn't know where that comment had come from. That's why I had to study Jung. I had to study archetypes. Something very deep embedded in me, way below all my ideological conditioning, was tapping into something I call empathy. It's so deeply embedded in us we can't get rid of it. All we can do is adopt political ideology in our brains so that empathy doesn't have a chance to be expressed, because it gets in the way of being successful, in the way of being a dominator. And I realized, of course, as a white male, I had not only been dehumanized, but I was dangerous. And so I'm a recovering white male, as much as it would be if I was an alcoholic. I'm recovering from that conditioning. It's very seductive to have all this privilege that comes from being a white male. I'm still learning about it. So that's all backdrop to my political work, which was lots of fasts on water only. I've been a tax refuser since 1983, which meant that for many years I didn't own property and I had to pay all my bills with postal money orders from day labor jobs. Of course, obstruction, public occupations of locations. Very important where you decide to sit. We all sit, but sometimes it's important where you sit. What's the context of what you're sitting for or around you? So I was becoming what people call a radical, but I didn't think of myself as a radical. I just thought of myself as I'm trying to make sense of this insanity, the theater of the absurd, the pathological nature of Western civilization. And my vet counselors and other therapists have said, we want to help you adapt, be able to be readjusted into the culture. And of course I said, I don't want to be readjusted into the culture. This is a sick place. I need to find my own health. And I know about archetypes now, so I know that deeply embedded in me there is all that I need to walk on a path of truth and honesty and feelings. I think from my reading of Jung, the major archetypes were empathy, mutual respect, cooperation, and equity, or a sense of fairness. What you might say, I learned anyways in Sunday school. By the way, I had perfect Sunday school attendance for 15 years. It was involuntary, yes, but I went every Sunday. It was the golden rule. You do unto others as you would have them do unto you. What a kind of a basic, and it's similar in every religion. So I knew that it was all a lie, and I wanted to reestablish my sense on the planet and the evolutionary journey of being a human being. So that's what this book is about. It's a book that weaves in my unraveling Western civilization, trying to become uncivilized, if you will, really documenting imperialism, very graphically as I traveled around the country, around the world. And I want to leave plenty of time for questions, but I will say about what happened to me on September 1st, just to fill in kind of the mystery of it, because it's still hard for people to grasp what happened. September 1st, 87 was exactly 1 year to the day after 3 veterans and myself started a water-only fast on the steps of the U.S. Capitol in protest of Reagan's policies in Central America. George Mizo, Duncan Murphy, Charlie Litke, and myself. George Mizo, 12 medals from Vietnam, platoon leader. Duncan Murphy, World War II ambulance driver, liberated Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in 45, which he still talks about in graphic detail. Charlie Litke, a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient from Vietnam, who before the fast turned his medal into the Vietnam Memorial as a Medal of Dishonor. He said, a medal drenched in the blood of the innocent. So we fasted it turns out, it was an open-ended fast, only water, no calories. People were pleading with us to stop. They were pleading with us to live, and we would constantly say to them, we're simply sitting here on the front steps of the Capitol building as a representative of all those people in Nicaragua and El Salvador who are being murdered. Can you relate to us and then to them? We are not worth more. They are not worth less. We're all one. We're all part of the one. We're all part of the one. Can you get it? And of course, it's not clear that people get it because we live so insulated in the United States. We're so insulated, isolated, and arrogant. And so after the 41st day of the fast, Senator Warren Rudman, so this is all backdrop for the year later that I'm about to tell you about. Warren Rudman, senator from New Hampshire at the time on the Intelligence Committee, quoted in the Boston Globe that headlined the article, Rudman labels fasting veterans as if Middle East terrorists. Very interesting that language was used. On the 46th day, George Mizo was adjudged by our doctor to be near death. We had all been motivated by the Irish hunger strikers. All of us knew about the Irish hunger strike of 1980. Bobby Sands was the leading name. And we were quite inspired to make some expression in a culture such as ours, just in such a Disney World mentality, to make some expression that went beyond words, went beyond petitioning, that simply tried to dramatize the depth of our anguish. So we ended the fast at the end of the 47th day because we didn't want George to die, even though we had gone into the fast thinking that we were all conceivably going to die sooner or later. So here a year later, many months in the war zones of both Nicaragua and Salvador between the fast in 86 and when we went to the Concord, California Naval Weapons Station, which was the largest weapons depot of the Pentagon on the West Coast. It was the source for all the weapons in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and it was the source for the weapons in Central America of Reagan's war against to stop what he called the Soviet beachhead. And so the vigil, the occupation at that base had been going on for 3 months before September 1st, and many munitions trucks and occasionally a munitions train had already been blocked, and many arrests had been made. So I was a jail support person until I decided that I and 2 other veterans, including Duncan Murphy, who had driven those ambulances into Bergen-Belsen in World War II, decided to fast on water only, on the tracks, on the railroad ties between the rails, for 40 days, not open-ended, just for 40 days. And expected, of course, to be arrested and maybe even spending most of that time in jail. But we told the authorities exactly what we were going to do in a letter to the commander of the base. And the facts are, at that base, that the train speed limit is 5 miles an hour, and it's a posted sign along the tracks. It's 5 miles an hour speed limit. A big sign near our vigil said the penalty for blocking federal munitions train is 1 year in prison and a $5,000 fine. So we knew what the consequences were. And there's always 2 spotters standing on the front of the locomotive in radio contact with the engineer at the back of the locomotive, telling the engineer that everything's okay and it's all clear. 5 mile an hour speed limit. Been doing this every day all summer. I've been doing it every day for long before that summer, but we were there every day that summer documenting it. Often the train went 3 or 4 miles an hour with boxcars and flatbed cars where you could see the crates of the rockets, the 500-pound bombs, millions of rounds of ammunition, mortars. You could see the trains going by every day. Okay, so we had 40 people with us that day. We had 5 cameras there that day. We had 1 videographer there that day. Usually the local police were there with us, waiting to arrest us. There was 350 armed Marines to protect the train and the trucks. And often there were a bunch of Marines not too far from us. So we took our position at 10 of 12 on September 1st, 87, because that's when the first train was coming that day. Plenty of visibility. We took our position on the tracks and expected to be arrested, removed, and arrested. 40 friends on either side of the tracks witnessing this and being there ready to watch whatever the police were going to do. Well, I woke up 4 days later in the hospital. I have no memory to this day, actually, what happened. But my 40 friends remember it. They were witnessing it. The 2 other veterans were not run over that. I was sitting in a lotus position. They were crouching on their feet. One of the other veterans dove to the left at the last second. Duncan, who drove that ambulance in the Bergen-Belsen, who was 67 at the time, jumped straight up and grabbed the railing that was on the platform above the cowcatcher where the 2 spotters were standing. He grabbed that railing. It was quite a leap. It was about a 10-foot leap. And his hands were on the same railing as the spotters as they were shaking their heads no, we're coming through. And he jumped off. And he was the first person to my body. It went completely under the train. The train, the FBI said, from looking at the 1 copy of the video footage, simply a friend of mine who was videoing the event, he wanted to make sure if there was police abuse, he got it on tape. FBI said the train was accelerating at 17 miles an hour at the point of impact, more than 3 times the speed limit. Well, what the hell was going on there? You know, I woke up in the hospital on September 5th, and the first thing I saw was a lot of plants at the base of my bed, green plants. I thought, this is a very strange jail cell. And my family was sitting to my right, next to my bed. And I said, how could a jail cell be like this? And they explained to me, you're in a hospital room, the train ran over you. I couldn't believe it. But that very same day, 9,000 people showed up at the tracks and ripped up 300 feet of the tracks with their hands and with hammers and picks and stacked up the railroad ties as pieces of sculpture. And from that day on, for 28 months, 24 hours a day, every train and every munitions truck was blocked. Now, they got through, but they had to have massive amounts of arrests every time. 2,100 people were arrested. Hundreds of people did jail time during that time, some for as long as a year. That's what the penalty said. You can be jailed for a year and fined $5,000. Not murdered or maimed. You can be arrested. So on the 18th day of my hospital stay, I still didn't even know I was missing my legs, because I was in a bed. My whole body was wrapped in various medical wrappings for all my injuries, and I had 2 feet sticking up at the base of my bed. I didn't even know they weren't really my feet, because I had phantom pain in my feet. It was intense. My feet were on fire with like spikes going in the bottom of my feet, and I was on morphine to mute the pain. So I didn't even know I didn't have my feet yet. I mean, people were telling me I didn't have my feet, but it didn't register. So this interrogator asked me, "When did you begin planning to hijack the train?" What? Hijack the train? And then in the depositions, the train crew admitted they had been ordered to not stop the train that day. An illegal order, and it was illegal to comply with an illegal order. Train speeding 17 miles an hour. The train crew was ordered not to stop. They claimed I was going to hijack the train. All the armed Marines that were standing near us didn't do anything. All they did was, as the train kept on going for another 300 feet, they went down and surrounded the train. Not us, not helping us. The Navy ambulance came about 2 minutes later, and they refused to help. Why? Because they said my body wasn't lying on Navy property, and they took off. But the picture on the cover of this book has the people that saved my life. My five of my 40 friends that were there that day, they're immediately stopping my bleeding. They had to hear the Navy ambulance people tell them the Navy ambulance wasn't going to help them and take me to a hospital, which delayed me for 17 minutes getting to the hospital. But thankfully, I have these friends. This is Duncan Murphy. He's hovering over my head as I'm lying on the tracks. He was the one that drove the ambulance in Bergen-Belsen. He fasted with me on the steps of the Capitol in '86. He was the one that jumped 10 feet up and grabbed the railing over the cowcatcher. It was the first one jumped off to get to my body. And he was just trying to keep my energy alive. The worst injury was the fact that a piece of my skull the size of a lemon was completely dislodged from my cranium. I have no idea how that happened, but you get hit by a 200,000-pound locomotive and something's going to happen. And the doctor said the reason I survived was that break completely dislodged, went in and destroyed my right frontal lobe. But because it completely broke from the cranium, they said they theorized that it broke the shock. So it was like a shock absorber that enabled my membrane around my brain to stay intact on the brain, except where the bone went through and lacerated the membrane. If any of you saw the Amy Goodman show on television, she actually got the original footage of the train crew from our dog and house sitter back in Portland. We had to get on the phone and have him get that DVD to somebody in Portland that was going to electronically send that to Amy Goodman that night before it was shown the next day. That was only the second time in my life I've actually seen my bleeding brain, because there was one shot in that footage where it's close up of my head that's profusely bleeding, but it's not. It's just a bleeding around the membrane. I was kind of stunned to see it myself. But at any rate, the other missing piece is the day after that interrogator came and talked to me, questioned me, somebody handed me an article from the Peoria, Illinois newspaper. And I didn't know why somebody was handing me that article, but it was about an FBI agent who was fired after almost 22 years. Why was he fired? Jack Ryan, FBI agent for 21 and a half years. Fired for refusing to investigate 6 people as domestic terrorist suspects: Duncan Murphy, George Mizo, Charlie Litke, Brian Willson. So we were considered domestic terrorists. That's why they were ordered not to stop, because they thought we were going to hijack the train, or at least that's what they said. Well, as you can see, 24 years later, I'm still walking. And it took me 8 years to write the book, 33 rejections by 33 publishers. Finally got one that said yes, they wanted to publish it. One of the agents that was not working as an agent for me but liked the manuscript, actually he had retired as an agent, but he was a friend who wanted to read the manuscript. He said the reason this book is hard for publishers to accept is because they don't know where to position the book in marketing, because it's not straight autobiography. It's about imperialism. It's about history of civilizations. It's about dysfunctional human nature. It's about lots of political activities that go beyond the normal realm of civil disobedience. I had 12 meetings with the IRS over the years. I've been a tax refuser, not a tax resistor, meaning I reported all my income and to the IRS on their forms, and simply refused to send a check, but I sent a letter with an asterisk. This is why I cannot send a check, because I'm obligated under Nuremberg not to pay for the murder of other people through my government's policies. And that's true, it is the law. Of course, I knew by then, long ago, that the law really is just a piece of paper, and it's used by the power establishment to obey, to comply, to enforce the law when they want to enforce it and not enforce it when they don't want to. And it's a very class and race-based society. I completely understand that. That's why I couldn't practice myself. But that went on for 16 years. And there was even one moment when the IRS came to my house in San Francisco when I had a little Nicaraguan boy, 6 years old, who had been in an ambush in Nicaragua. He was up in San Francisco, where I was living at the time, for surgery at Shriners Hospital. He was shot through the face as well as through the shoulder. And he was with me the day the doorbell rang, and little Eric Lopez and I were playing checkers. And I was in my wheelchair, and I wheeled to the door, and it was Nathan Kaminsky. Nathan Kaminsky was the IRS agent I'd been dealing with all these years. And I had met him before at his office, and he'd been at my house before. But here he was again. I said, Nathan, this is a great time for you to be at the house, because I want to introduce you to Eric Lopez, whose face was completely skewed by bullet wounds. I said, and by that time he was speaking conversational English, and I asked Eric, tell Nathan, Eric, what happened to you? He describes this ambush in graphic detail. 18 people murdered. His mother, including his baby brother. He and his mother survived. The fetus in her womb did not survive. And 2 other people survived out of 22. And he describes this whole ambush and how they survived by feigning death in a ditch after they'd been shot off the back of the truck. But his mother lost her left eye, she lost her left leg, she lost her fetus and her 1-year-old baby in her arms. Eric was hit 3 times. And I said to Mr. Kaminsky, now, do you really think that I would give money to an organization that does that? Do you think I have no honor? I mean, and of course he never talked. He was just always trying to hand me papers to sign a statement. I would start making payments every month, $50,000 worth. And he just said, I'll see you in court. I said, I've been saying that every time we've been meeting. I said, I'm prepared to do my time in prison, but I can't. It's not even complicated for me. I'm not going to cooperate. And so that just illustrates, another aspect of why some people find me hard to deal with, because some things I've just insisted I'm going to do or not do based on what I've learned on my walk. And maybe I'll stop there. And I would love to get into discussion